Psychedelics. We're focusing on what I call the classical psychedelics, so things like LSD, DMT, psilocybin. And, for most of our listeners, these substances live in a very contentious legal and cultural space, not just in North America, but,
Yeah.
well, globally.
It's a field that is just riddled with the ghosts of the 1960s, but also recent medical breakthroughs
Yeah.
and these incredibly powerful cultural narratives. The text really forces us as empirical social scientists to try and move beyond all that and just look at the data. So what's the central tension here? What are the sources asking us to hold in our minds as we go through this?
The core mission is really to analyze the evidence, to explore this
Yeah.
persistent duality that's woven through the entire chapter. I mean, are these potent, mind-altering experiences fundamentally pathological? Do they lead to mental disorganization, danger, social instability? Or do they enhance well-being? Do they offer profound, maybe even necessary, insights that can transform a person's life in a sustained, positive way? We're constantly balancing these themes of, acute danger versus long-term benefit and transient delusion versus potential genuine insight.
Okay, let's unpack that empirical duality. And let's start where the public conversation almost always starts. Risk. I mean, when most people hear the word psychedelic, they immediately think high risk, public crisis, irreparable harm. The chapter addresses this head on, using some truly surprising studies on relative dangerousness.
It does. And the source material is compelling because it demands we use a quantitative comparative framework. We have to move beyond just anecdotes and, moral panics. This framework is best represented by these relative drug dangerousness analyses, like the big studies done by Professor David Nutt and his colleagues in the UK. They provide this comprehensive risk matrix that looks at harm across multiple vectors: physical toxicity, addiction potential, harm to society, and so on.
And when you actually place the classical psychedelics within that framework, the results they challenge decades of conventional wisdom.
Absolutely. The scientific consensus that came out of these analyses, it points to a highly counterintuitive finding. The classical psychedelics, specifically a substance like LSD, are regarded as less harmful than some substances that are not only legal but widely consumed. The physical toxicity is extremely low, and the addictive potential is basically negligible.
The source even quotes Nutt confronting this directly, right? This public shock.
Yes, and it's a crucial quote because it shows how empirical data can just clash with political reality. He was challenged on television. The question was basically, you're not seriously telling us that LSD is less harmful than alcohol, are you? And his answer, based purely on the data, was a simple, unambiguous, of course I am. For a social scientist, that data point alone means we have to completely rethink our public health communication strategies. If our risk models are wrong, our interventions can't be effective.
But the chapter provides a really essential, non-negotiable caveat here. It stops us from falling into the opposite trap of just romanticizing these compounds.
That's the critical piece. The sources are very clear. No psychoactive drug has a zero-risk profile. Whether it's caffeine, alcohol, psilocybin, there are always risks associated with use, regardless of legal status. But when we, as social policy analysts, evaluate danger, we have to contextualize those risks. Right now, we are navigating this devastating public health crisis around opioid overdose deaths. So we have to measure the profound psychological risks of psychedelics relative to the known, escalating, and often fatal threats posed by other substances.
It's a tension the text holds throughout, this idea of physical safety versus the risk of profound psychological disorganization. So moving from that empirical assessment of risk to the history, let's get into the bizarre, almost accidental origin story of LSD itself.
This is really the seminal moment that launched the entire modern field. The story centers on Albert Hofmann, a Swiss chemist at Sandoz Laboratories. In 1938, he synthesized dolisergic acid diethylamide, or LSD-25. He was looking for a respiratory and circulatory stimulant. After the initial tests, they just set it aside. It didn't have the properties they were looking for. Scientifically, it was a dead end.
But something clearly lingered in his mind for 5 years.
It did. The source describes him as being unable to shake a peculiar presentiment that LSD-25 might have some other novel properties. This intuition, the scientific hunch, it led him to resynthesize the compound in 1943. And it was during this final stage of crystallization on April 16th that the accidental exposure happened.
Can you describe that first totally unplanned experience?
So Hoffman was working with the compound, and he started to feel this profound sense of restlessness, some dizziness, mild intoxication. It forced him to stop work and go home. He lies down, closes his eyes, and he's immediately immersed in this intense internal visual world. He described it as an uninterrupted stream of fantastic pictures, extraordinary shapes with intense kaleidoscopic play of colors. He figured he must have absorbed a tiny amount through his fingertips or maybe inhaled some vapors. This experience, it lasted about 2 hours. It was mild, but it convinced him he had to investigate its true potency.
And so 3 days later, April 19th, comes the intentional self-experiment, the one we now call Bicycle Day. And he chose what he thought was a very conservative dose.
Precisely. He dosed himself with 250 micrograms, which he believed was a safe, minimal dose for a compound where the active threshold was completely unknown. He was catastrophically wrong. He started feeling the effects within an hour, and they just escalated rapidly. He quickly felt this overwhelming need to cycle home, and his lab assistant went with him.
What was that immediate subjective state like at that much stronger dose?
The initial state was defined by sheer, unadulterated terror. He was convinced the LSD was poisoning him. He said he was seized by the dreadful fear of going insane, and he had this sensation of leaving his body. His reality was completely distorted. He thought his neighbor was a malevolent witch. He was afraid he might have actually died. This intense psychological challenge lasted for hours.
That moment, that terrifying realization of losing all self-control, that's really the origin of the danger narrative, isn't it? But the experience shifted later that evening.
It did. As the chemical peak passed, the terror started to subside, and he was left with these transcendent, beautiful elements. Fantastic images surged toward him, constantly shifting into spirals and circles. The synesthesia was profound. A sound would become a changing, vivid image, each with its own consistent form and color. By the next morning, he felt totally refreshed and fundamentally changed. He realized he'd encountered something terrifying, yes, but also profound and maybe even mystical. And that tension terror leading to transcendence, that's the foundational paradox of this whole field.
So as we move into the 50s and 60s, these substances went from being a pharmaceutical curiosity to a tool for exploring radical alterations of consciousness. And one of the most fascinating intersections was with the neuroscientist John Lilly and his work with sensory isolation tanks.
Right. Lilly was already pushing the boundaries of consciousness research. He was studying how the mind behaves when you deprive it of all external sensory input, total darkness, silence, uniform temperature. The combination of the isolation tank with LSD created this environment that was just designed to push the ego boundary to its absolute limit.
And what were the defining results of putting those two things together?
Lilly described a process of complete dissolution. He'd get in the tank, take the LSD, and he'd reason that he was fully in control of his own brain circuits, that he could manage the fear. But as the drug took hold, all sensory input just vanished. He reported, and this is a quote from the text, that the darkness, the silence, the wetness, and the warmth disappeared. The external reality of the tank disappeared. But significantly, his awareness of his own body and even his brain also vanished.
So what was left?
A radical reduction of consciousness to its most essential state. Lilly described the totality of his experience collapsing until all that was left was a small point. This profound loss of boundaries between self and environment, body and consciousness, this is a recurring feature in high-dose psychedelic reports. It shows how the brain can stop modeling the body and the world in its usual rigid way. For social scientists, this suggests that the boundaries we see as stable, essential parts of our identity are, well, they're neurologically mediated and actually highly pliable.
This research was initially embraced by some academics, but the trajectory, it skewed very quickly, didn't it? Largely because of figures like Timothy Leary, who went from scientific investigation to outright proselytization.
Leary is the exact moment when the science of psychedelics just collides with counterculture and politics, and it leads to this massive intellectual backlash. He was a respected psychologist at Harvard. He initially conducted legitimate studies, even if they were a bit loosely controlled, but after hundreds of his own experiences, he became convinced that these substances were the key to humanity's spiritual evolution.
And this shift culminates in his famous mantra, turn on, tune in, and drop out. What was the deeper meaning behind those commands?
So turn on was the command to find the sacramental interior world that he believed you could access through psychedelics. Tune in meant externalizing that profound, heightened awareness into the collective consciousness, usually through art, music, poetry. And dropping out was the socio-political part, a call to detach, gracefully and consciously, from what Leary saw as the arbitrary, materialistic social commitments that were poisoning the modern spirit.
Leary's enthusiasm, his advocacy, it basically became the catalyst for the downfall of the entire research field for decades.
It was. Leary and his colleague, Richard Alpert, they eventually came to believe they had moved beyond the usual concerns of academic psychologists. This dismissal of methodological rigor, of scientific controls, of empirical constraints, coupled with this intense public advocacy, it just fueled a narrative that psychedelics were inherently dangerous, irresponsible, and uncontrollable. For the social scientist listener, this is a huge lesson. The political rejection of the research wasn't just driven by the drugs themselves. It was driven by the failure of their proponents to stick to the empirical constraints you need for academic and regulatory acceptance. The anti-science stance became inseparable from the substance, and that ensured the research shutdown that began in the late 1960s.
Okay, so let's shift focus now to the core subjective experience. What really defines the phenomenology of a classical psychedelic trip, regardless of which substance is used?
The subjective experience is characterized by intense emotional lability and dramatic perceptual distortion. Users consistently report these rapid, cycling mood swings from oceanic bliss and profound happiness to overwhelming sadness or grief. And often, these totally disparate emotions exist at the same time. The cognitive domain is equally altered. You get the sense of entering a domain that's described as boundless, timeless, and ineffable. Time stops moving linearly. The boundaries of reality seem to melt.
And this boundary dissolution can sometimes result in identity shifts that are so profound they go into this highly metaphorical territory.
The sources give a really striking example from the anthropologists' masters in Houston. They studied participants who were exploring animal metamorphosis rites. One man, while under the influence, strongly visualized himself as a tiger. And while he maintained the intellectual realization that he wasn't literally a tiger, he felt this powerful emotional and somatic connection to that identity. Crucially, the experience led him to conclude that the tiger represented a valid and essential aspect of what or who he was.
That's more than just a simple hallucination. How does the social science text interpret an experience like that?
It suggests the experience is a kind of metaphorical shape-shifting that allows for reorganization of the self. The brain is temporarily generating this radical alternative self-representation, and it forces the user to confront and integrate these powerful, maybe repressed drives or identities that are symbolized by the animal. The perceived validity of the experience is key. It wasn't just a random image. It was a deeply felt, self-relevant discovery about an essential part of his personality. It's a temporary ontological shift that, regardless of its objective truth, has profound psychological utility.
Speaking of profoundly strange and consistently reported experiences, we have to talk about DMT dimethyltryptamine and this phenomenon of entity encounters at high doses.
DMT is fascinating. Its duration is extraordinarily short, often less than 15 minutes, and the consistency of the phenomenological reports is just stunning. This was documented by researchers like Rick Strassman at the University of New Mexico. In his studies, sufficiently high doses led to these highly specific narrative experiences that just defied cultural expectation.
And what were the consistent features of these encounters?
The consistent report was the immediate and intense presence of aliens or entities or beings. Users reported being manipulated, experimented on, receiving information, often within these highly technological or advanced settings. Sometimes they even reported device implantation. The sheer volume and the consistency of these narrative details, regardless of the user's background or prior beliefs, that's what makes the data so compelling.
This level of consistency, of course, led to the very controversial alien hypothesis.
Correct. The specific narrative consistency led to the suggestion that maybe a rapid, massive surge of endogenous DMT in the brain, potentially from the pineal gland, the so-called third eye, could account for anomalous experiences reported in the general population.
Like alien abduction experiences.
Exactly. The phenomenology of the drug state mirrored the descriptions given by non-drug users who reported these phenomena.
For the empirically minded listener, though, this is where biological constraints come in and prevent us from jumping to metaphysical conclusions.
Precisely. While the pineal gland is known to produce melatonin, the biological counterpoint argues really strongly against this massive DMT surge hypothesis. To induce the reported psychoactive effects, the brain would need to synthesize and release DMT in quantities in the high milligram range, all within about 10 to 20 seconds. The physiological machinery required to ramp up production and release that fast. It's currently believed not to exist. It would require a metabolic process faster than the brain is chemically capable of. So the biological reality makes the hypothesis highly unlikely, even while the phenomenological similarity remains this fascinating intellectual puzzle.
So moving from the lab back to modern cultural impact, the chapter gives a lot of attention to the explosion of ayahuasca tourism. This substance, which has DMT and a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, has driven this massive movement of Westerners seeking profound self-help.
Ayahuasca tourism is a critical sociological case study in the modern psychedelic landscape. It's centered largely around hubs like Iquitos, Peru, and it's grown exponentially since the 1990s. We're talking tens of thousands of Western travelers every year seeking out ceremonies, often packaged by ecotourism operators.
And it's gained this huge popular reputation as a panacea, right? A quick fix for everything from existential malaise to severe PTSD.
It is very heavily marketed and perceived as a holistic cure-all. And while there are countless anecdotal accounts of genuine therapeutic breakthroughs, particularly around trauma and depression, wellness culture.
Before we get into the long-term outcomes, let's just briefly circle back to the physiological basis, which is key to understanding both the potential adverse effects and the therapeutic mechanisms. The text specifies the neurochemical pathway.
The mechanism is quite uniform across the classical psychedelics, LSD, psilocybin, DMT. Their primary action involves increasing activity in serotonergic pathways, specifically by stimulating the 5-HT2 subtype of serotonergic receptors. This is the physiological key that unlocks those massive perceptual and psychological alterations.
For listeners who need to bridge that gap between receptor stimulation and seeing geometric patterns, how does that physiological change actually manifest experientially?
The stimulation of 5-HT2A receptors is strongly correlated with a fundamental disruption of the brain's baseline activity patterns. Specifically, it's been shown to reduce activity in what's called the default mode network, or DMN.
The DMN?
Right. The DMN is essentially the brain's internal editor and self-referential system. It constructs and maintains the ego, the sense of me, and it filters reality. By dampening the DMN, psychedelics temporarily lift that filter, leading to a state of hyperconnectivity across traditionally segregated brain regions. And this hyperconnectivity is the neurological basis for the mystical experience, for boundary dissolution, and for the influx of novel, often meaningful information.
But this profound disruption can lead to significant long-term adverse consequences, which the chapter details very carefully. What are the key long-term negative outcomes?
One of the major non-psychotic adverse outcomes is the potential for severe mental disorganization that persists long after the drug's acute effects have faded. This isn't just a hangover. This is a profound, enduring shift in psychological stability that can last for months, even years, and often requires ongoing support.
And a related and widely misunderstood outcome is the phenomenon of flashbacks, which is now clinically defined as HPPD.
Hallucinogen persisting perception disorder. HPPD is a persistent alteration where the boundaries between the drug state and the ordinary waking state remain compromised. It's characterized by an increase in hypnagogic imagery, those fleeting visual phenomena we all experience as we fall asleep or wake up. But these images and dreams take on the full vividness, intensity, and perceptual peculiarities of drug trips. It can be like a low-level continuous visual static or disturbance that can be highly distracting and debilitating.
The most severe adverse outcome, which social policy analysts have to pay closest attention to, is the connection between psychedelic use and the precipitation of acute psychosis.
This is a critical area for rigorous empirical analysis because the figures are often used inaccurately in public discourse. Incidence figures for acute psychosis after psychedelic use in older studies range from 0.08% up to 4.6%. However, when researchers rigorously analyzed the individuals who were hospitalized for psychedelic-induced psychosis, a really striking and critical pattern emerged.
Which was the presence of a pre-existing vulnerability.
Exactly. The source material reviews data showing that a large minority, between 37% and 49% of those hospitalized for LSD psychosis, had received prior psychiatric treatment. This strongly indicates that the drugs are not causing a new disorder in healthy individuals.
Instead, they're acting as a trigger or a catalyst for a latent disorder.
That is the compelling interpretation for the social science audience. Psychedelics appear to precipitate or accelerate an underlying psychological vulnerability that was already destined to manifest, perhaps at a later date. For therapeutic contexts, this just emphasizes the absolute necessity of careful pre-screening for personal and family histories of psychosis and severe mental illness. It shifts the focus from danger to everyone to high risk for a specific subset.
Okay, let's pivot now to the profound evidence of therapeutic applications that directly counter that danger narrative. Starting with pain, The analgesic effects seem dramatically unique.
They are unique not just in how well they work, but for how long. Psychedelics have demonstrated an ability to provide dramatic analgesic effects, particularly for intractable pain that is unresponsive to powerful opioid narcotics. What's most astonishing for the listener is that these pain-relieving effects have been shown to persist for weeks after the acute intoxication is worn off.
If the substance is only active for a few hours, how can the pain relief last for weeks?
The mechanism is believed to be fundamentally psychological and cognitive. It reflects that structural reorganization we talked about. In some cases, the pain might be fully attenuated, but in others, the physiological signal of pain may still be there, but the emotional and cognitive suffering associated with it just disappears. The drug seems to allow a psychological decoupling, where the pain signal no longer monopolizes a person's attention and emotional resources. It shifts the brain's entire relationship to the pain, which is far more profound than just simple numbing.
And this decoupling effect is arguably most impactful in end-of-life care, where the focus shifts from physical pain to existential terror.
This is one of the most unique and historically important applications. For terminal patients facing severe anxiety and existential fear related to death, psychedelics have demonstrated an unparalleled ability to change attitudes toward mortality. The experiences often involve a profound sense of cosmic connection and unity, leading to ego dissolution. When the ego, the fear-driven, self-preserving me, temporarily dissolves and is then reintegrated, the core psychological fear of non-existence is profoundly lessened.
The ability to reorganize a person's core psychological structures around the fundamental fear of human existence, it speaks volumes about the drug's potential beyond routine pharmacology. What other therapeutic uses paved the way for the renewed research?
Early studies demonstrated potential in treating chronic conditions, including substance abuse disorders like alcoholism and heroin addiction, as well as highly ritualistic disorders like obsessive-compulsive disorder, or OCD. These findings provided the initial, measurable, and physiologically grounded data points that were necessary to argue for renewed scientific inquiry.
Which brings us to this strategic shift and the eventual renaissance of research that culminated around 2006. After the regulatory shutdown prompted by Leary, how did scientists manage to restart a dialogue that policymakers would actually listen to?
This required a deliberate, strategic political maneuver. The researchers recognized that the Leary era had failed because it prioritized the drug's ability to alter consciousness and belief, which directly undermined the conventional structures of authority in government and academia.
So the strategy became to de-emphasize the mystical and focus only on the quantifiable physiological benefits.
Precisely. Starting in the mid-1990s, the researchers deliberately reframed psychedelics not as agents of spiritual revolution, but as any other drugs to be investigated. The focus shifted entirely to demonstrable physiological effects, treating severe substance abuse, reducing pain, alleviating depression in terminal patients. This physiological framing was key because it allowed them to bypass the loaded cultural politics of the 1960s and gain crucial regulatory permission to conduct controlled, rigorous studies.
The source material notes that while this strategy worked politically, it risks overlooking the true potential for ontological awakening. The field was essentially reborn by focusing on the measurable, not the transcendent.
That is the paradox. The researchers had to suppress the discussion of transcendence to get regulatory permission, but the true breakthroughs are often directly tied to that transcendent experience. The text credits this strategic shift with paving the way for the 3 events in 2006 that spurred the open scientific renaissance, allowing them, eventually, to return to studying the existential and spiritual well-being effects, but under rigorous modern controls.
That strategic push to reclaim the study of existential well-being led directly to efforts to quantify transcendence. And the most controversial and legendary study in the psychology of religion to ever tackle this was the Good Friday experiment back in 1962.
This was a landmark, highly ambitious study by Walter Pahnke at Harvard. It involved 20 divinity students who were preparing for an Easter service. Half received psilocybin, the active compound in magic mushrooms, and the other half got an active placebo, which was nicotinic acid.
And the text stresses that the preparation of the participants was just as crucial as the compound itself.
Absolutely. The preparation was meticulously designed to maximize the likelihood of a positive, meaningful experience. This meant creating an atmosphere to maximize positive expectation, trust, confidence, and reduction of fear. The participants were prepped to view the experience as potentially sacramental. It was conducted in a revered setting during a significant religious service. This preparation reflects the core understanding that set, setting, and expectation are fundamental modulators of the psychedelic experience.
So based on Ponke's post-session measurements using established mysticism scales, did the psilocybin actually induce mystical experiences?
It was a dramatic success. Participants who got the psilocybin reported significantly elevated scores across all subcategories of mystical experience. This included the subjective experience of transcending space and time, a sense of oneness or unity, a profound feeling of sacredness, and most importantly, the sense of a noetic quality, the feeling that the experience provided genuine, objective knowledge or insight into reality.
We have a specific anecdote from one participant, Mike Young, that really illustrates the sheer intensity and difficulty of these spiritual breakthroughs.
Jung's experience is a powerful illustration of that duality of terror and transcendence. It began with intense confusion, difficulty telling inner thoughts from outer reality. Then, the visual distortions began to resolve into this structured, radial mandala, which he instantly interpreted as representing the different possible paths his life could take. He felt agonizingly immobilized at the center, just trapped by indecision for what felt like an eternity.
And the breakthrough came from a moment of profound psychological pain.
Yes. In that moment of intense psychological crisis, Jung realized he died. The agonizing tension of his indecision, the constraints of his previous identity, they just gave way. And in that dying, he recognized a sudden freedom to choose who he could become. Years later, he connected the vision back to a concrete struggle over a career path. But the lasting impact was that this transcendent experience anchored his religious ideas to something much deeper than belief and theory.
And it's crucial to reiterate, as the chapter does, that these insights were not delivered in a uniformly pleasant way.
That is vital for our listener to grasp. The transcendence was bought with psychological suffering. Jung reported the incredibly painful sensation that his insides were being clawed out during the peak of the experience. A later follow-up of the participants revealed that only 2 of the 7 psilocybin recipients reported their experience as being uniformly pleasant. It mirrors the shamanic tradition where initiation rites are inherently psychologically challenging.
So, given the methodological shortcomings of 1960s research standards, the enduring success of the Good Friday experiment just demanded a modern replication using impeccable contemporary rigor. What is the final conclusion regarding the role of psychedelics in human consciousness?
The source material positions psychedelics as offering transcendent insights and functioning as a powerful, rapid catalyst for psychological reorganization. They're not merely causing transient hallucinations. They are forcing a fundamental, albeit temporary, disruption of ordinary cognitive patterns, allowing the brain to restructure its self-model and its relationship with the world.
But this brings us back to the crucial philosophical sticking point that has to be addressed, the problem of veridicality.
Veridicality, for our listener, is the philosophical concept of truthfulness or accuracy. Did Mike Young really witness an eternal reality, or was it a subjectively useful delusion created by a serotonin agonist? The insights feel absolutely true, sacred, and knowledge-bearing to the user, yet they cannot be confirmed objectively by any observer in the ordinary waking state.
And the chapter concludes by saying that even if these insights are not juridical, if they're merely brain chemistry, their capacity to lead to profound, long-term positive changes, like reduced fear of death, increased empathy, and sustained well-being, makes the question of their objective reality secondary to their therapeutic and sociological utility.
That is the ultimate tension. The insights are ontologically unprovable, yet pragmatically transformative. The results demand that social scientists engage with the effects of the disruption, regardless of the ultimate cause of the belief system it creates.
This has been an expansive and really challenging deep dive. We started with the intense social and legal fear surrounding psychedelics, and we reviewed data that places their relative physical risk well below that of alcohol. Yet we ended by looking at rigorous modern empirical data that demonstrates sustained, positive reorganization of the self, breakthroughs in existential meaning, and therapeutic potential for intractable problems like chronic pain and the fear of death.
The empirical analysis of Chapter 7 fundamentally forces us to confront the limitations of our conventional view of reality. Psychedelics disrupt the ordinary filtering and patterning mechanisms of the brain, and that forces us to question the stability and constraints of what we call normal consciousness.
You alluded to that fascinating filter or constrainer hypothesis earlier. How does the source material elaborate on the philosophical implication of this disruption for our daily lives?
The source material suggests that our ordinary waking consciousness may be less of an active producer of reality and more of a highly specialized, evolutionarily useful constrainer or filter. The brain, in its normal state, screens out a massive bandwidth of information, sensory, emotional, maybe even ontological, in order to maintain a stable, functional reality model for survival. The disruption caused by these substances or other naturally occurring states like near-death experiences may momentarily crack open that filter, allowing novel, often profound information or patterns of thought to flood into subjective experience.
That reframes our perception entirely. If powerful self-transformation and ontological awakening can result simply from chemically or naturally disrupting the ordinary waking state, from this crack-open moment where the brain temporarily stops filtering,